The worst moment came in front of 30 people, with my phone lighting up with a client complaint and Mark leaning over the conference table like he wanted to be a judge. He slammed a printed report down and said, "You are lucky I do not fire you today." I remember the exact way he said it. It was quiet enough that you only heard it in the room, but loud enough that everyone knew it was for me. I worked on the operations team at Willow and Pine Retail, a national chain with 300 stores. My title was Loss Prevention and Systems Specialist. I handled security camera systems, inventory reconciliation for high-value items, and the data feeds that tied those two things together. My job mattered because when the cameras recorded and the inventory reports matched the point of sale, we could stop shrinkage before it became a headline. I had spent the last 6 months pushing one thing: a retention change to our surveillance storage system. I had raised it in tickets, in emails, and on 3 leadership reviews. I warned that if we cut retention to meet a short-term budget target, we risked losing footage for a rolling window of incidents worth about $40,000, based on our average claim amounts over the last year. Mark was my department head. He had that smooth confidence people mistake for competence. He liked quick wins and headlines. He liked telling the regional office he was saving money. He also hated bad press. That combination meant he thought policies were suggestions and math was a hindrance. At first, he dismissed my requests as cautious. Then he started to ignore them. A week before the stand-up, I had sent a formal change request and an impact assessment to Mark and to the vendor. The change request was in Ticket 4729, and it included a spreadsheet titled Surveillance Retention Analysis, Q4, with calculations showing how retention tied directly to average loss claim amounts. $40,000 in projected exposure if we reduced retention from 30 days to 7 days across all stores during a holiday quarter surge. I attached vendor quotes for extended storage, 3 maintenance invoices for the last quarter, and a calendar invite for a follow-up meeting on the 6th. Mark opened the ticket. He did not reply. The ticket history showed he read it on a Tuesday at 10:12 a.m. AT. The stand-up, we were supposed to review last quarter and the rollout of a new shelf tagging system called ShelfSense. Instead, we were reeling from an immediate crisis. A major anchor client at one of our largest malls had called legal and demanded to speak to someone about missing footage related to a theft ring. They claimed we owed them $40,000 in undetected losses and threatened to pull all in-mall special events unless we could produce footage. A quick run through our dashboard showed something that made my stomach drop. 89 cameras across 12 stores had no recoverable footage for the critical 7-day window. The performance metrics dashboard flagged them as no retention, and the timestamp for when the retention policy changed was 5 days earlier. Mark pounded his palm and said, "Who approved this? Who disabled retention?" The team looked around. Some people looked like they expected me to take the fall. I had been the one who had warned them. I had been the one with the ticket. I took a breath and I said, I logged the impact and recommended we keep a 30-day retention until we had vendor confirmation. The change request is in Ticket 4729. The vendor quote for 15 additional terabytes was in the ticket. Mark blinked. Then he turned his face hard toward me and said, "This is on you. You saw the new budget plan. You let it happen. You are lucky I do not fire you today." I smiled politely. I closed my laptop slowly and stood up. I did not shout. I did not beg. I told him, "We can go through the change history. I will pull the vendor logs and the invoice trail now." I left the room with my hands steady and my palms dry. That day was the first escalation. The second came when the client publicly demanded answers on the company call. The third happened over the next 48 hours when customer complaints increased and insurance asked for footage. Each escalation chipped away at my credibility, the team's trust in me, my chance at the promotion I had been lined up for, and the sense that anyone was on my side. I kept working. I did the thing people forget to celebrate. I documented. I downloaded the retention change record from our vendor portal, and it clearly showed a policy update processed at 9:43 a.m., 5 days earlier. The system tagged the request as approved by user Mark. The vendor system included an audit trail with a user IP, and the IP matched a laptop assigned to Mark on the asset register. I saved screenshots and exported the audit in a CSV file. I printed the vendor invoice that showed a one-time maintenance hold scheduled the same day. I pulled the calendar history and found an invite that Mark had declined called Storage Cost Review, which ironically was the exact meeting where I asked for time to present the risk. In the invite notes I had written, recommend postpone retention cut until vendor confirms backup. Mark had declined the invite with a one-word response: budget. I also pulled receipts. The vendor had issued a purchase order number PO3304 for extended storage that I had drafted and sent to Mark for approval on Monday at 8:07 a.m. The purchase order stayed unapproved. On Tuesday at 9:30 a.m., Mark had sent a brief internal chat saying, cancel PO3304, we need a budget cut immediately. The chat thread was between Mark, the procurement analyst, and a director in finance. I printed that chat. I exported the procurement system's log showing the purchase order cancellation. Every document I saved was dated, time-stamped, and clearly labeled. I kept a running folder called Evidence Pack, Cameras, and Retention. Then things got worse in a way I had not expected. Mark began to actively pin blame. He started telling the operations team that I had failed to follow up on his instruction. He had a talent for turning his own cut corners into other people's negligence. He wrote a summary email to the regional office where he omitted the change request entirely and said, operational error on camera oversight. The email used the phrase failure to act directed at me without attaching ticket 4729. The email landed in the general distribution with my name in the subject line. People forward things in a crisis, and within an hour the rumor mill had a new version. It cost us a client. At home that night, I opened the evidence pack and began a timeline. I write timelines a lot. They are like a map when you feel lost. I put every interaction in order. My original ask, the vendor quote, the purchase order, the meeting decline, Mark reading the ticket, his chat to procurement, the retention policy change in the vendor portal, the client call, and the missing footage. The link between Mark's cancellation and the policy change was loud and clear in the timestamps. But I also knew something else. If I wanted to beat a public accusation, I could not be reactive. I needed to be procedural and public, not defensive and private. On day 3, Mark tried another move. He scheduled a quick, private one-on-one with me in conference room B3 at 4 p.m. He wanted to clarify expectations. I kept my calendar free and I smiled politely when I walked in. He closed the door. He began with a long lecture about loose ends and accountability. He then slid a printed reprimand across the table that he had drafted with human resources language and signed with for review. He hoped that humiliation plus paperwork would make me back down. I took a breath. I did not explode. I told him, everything in this office has a paper trail, Mark. If you want to put this in writing, let's make sure the chain is accurate. He stammered. He wanted me to sign his version. I refused. I asked for the evidence he was using. He had nothing. He tried to threaten me with silence. If you make a fuss, I will escalate the issue and make sure it follows you. I stood up, handed the reprimand back, and said, if you escalate, the full audit will need to be reviewed. I walked away quietly. That calm mattered. Other people would have screamed or cried. I knew that if I stayed calm and consistent, the chain of documents I had would not be broken by anger. I also started quietly making allies. 2 people on the team I had helped months earlier with a camera wiring audit came to me privately. They told me they had seen Mark change purchase order entries in their presence. One of them, Sandra from store operations, sent me a text. You were right about retention. I saw the cancellation come through. I will back you up. Day 4 was the worst. The client made a formal demand in writing for $40,000 plus reputational damages. The legal team asked for any footage we had and for an internal explanation. Our insurance carrier put a hold on coverage until we produced evidence. The regional office started asking for immediate fixes and names. My name was in 3 emails as the person responsible for oversight. The promotion I had been promised turned into a question. What went wrong, Ayet? I answered every email with the facts, included ticket 4729, and attached the evidence pack. I did not rant. I wrote plainly. I tracked every read receipt. By the end of the day, I had compiled a 40-page dossier of logs, receipts, chats, invoices, and a single-page timeline labeled sequence of events. Retention policy change. On day 5, Mark attempted to erase his digital fingerprint. He asked the vendor account manager to clean up audit noise and reassign the policy change to a system process. The vendor responded that audit trails could not be modified and that any attempt would be logged as an administrative action. That email was CC'd to procurement and to the vendor. I saved it. On day 6, someone higher up noticed the inconsistency. The regional vice president, Grace, requested a joint meeting with legal and the client for the next morning. She wanted a status update and a proposed remediation plan. Mark tried to draft a plan that would involve me taking full responsibility and writing a corrective action plan. He wanted a public apology from me. He planned to present it as humility and accountability. That night he sent me a text that said, "Sign the apology draft and we move on." I did not respond. The next morning, the mood in conference room B3 felt like jury duty. The client was on speaker. Grace was on a video call and looked as tight as a drum. Legal, procurement, and human resources were present. Mark walked in like he had been rehearsing. He began by taking blame publicly, but in the way of a person trying to shift heat. "We had an oversight. We are working with our vendor." I watched him for a beat, then I asked for permission to speak. Grace nodded. I said, "I pulled every record related to the retention change. The change request is ticket 4729 and it was never approved." The purchase order PO 3304 was canceled by Mark at 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday. The retention policy shows a change on vendor portal at 9:43 a.m. on Tuesday, triggered by an administrative approval registered to Mark's account. Vendor audit logs confirm the sequence. I have these documents. I clicked to share my screen. I showed the CSV export from the vendor portal. I showed the procurement chat with the exact minute Mark told procurement to cancel the purchase order. I showed the calendar decline to the meeting where I asked to postpone the retention cut. I showed the vendor invoice for scheduled maintenance that never happened. The client went quiet. Legal leaned forward. Grace's face changed. The lines around her eyes softened and then went cold in a different way. There was a pause long enough for people to check their own notes. Then Mark's face, which had been flinty and controlled, shifted like a mask slipping. He looked at the vendor export on my screen, then at the procurement chat, then at his own laptop. For a moment, he attempted the same line he had used in the stand-up. He said, "There has to be some mistake. That log can be wrong." The vendor account manager, who had been on the call, said, "We do not alter audit logs. We can tell you the user ID that processed the change." The user ID mapped to his company account. He swallowed. Mark's voice lost its practiced edge and became small. He said, "I thought the budget lead approved it." Grace looked at him like someone looking at a slipped gear. He had no one to blame. Mark tried a different tack. He said, "You should have followed up." I stayed calm. I said, "I did follow up. I created a ticket. I asked for sign-off. If you're questioning my follow-up, I will provide every read receipt, every timestamp, and the calendar invite where I asked for a pause." The procurement chat shows the cancellation. The vendor portal shows the administrative action. It is all here. I let the files speak. Then came the moment I had been building toward but had not wanted to seek out like vengeance. The client asked, "Who canceled the purchase order?" There was a silence. Mark could have answered differently. He did not. He admitted, and his voice sounded like someone pulling a loose thread. He said, "I canceled the purchase order. I approved the retention cut because I wanted to hit the budget number. I did not think we would lose data in this way. I am sorry." Saying sorry in front of the room did not undo the damage, but it changed the frame. It was a real admission. It was not the deflection he had used before. It was public and specific. My revenge was not dramatic. I did not shout it from the roof. I did what I had promised myself I would do if the time came. I had built a body of evidence, kept calm, and let the truth be undeniable in a group where the consequences would naturally flow through human resources and legal. That is how you force a system to act. You make the facts visible to the right people at the right time. After the meeting, human resources opened an investigation. Procurement reissued the purchase order with immediate approval and scheduled the vendor for emergency remediation to restore any recoverable footage. The vendor estimated we could salvage partial footage from off-site caches for some stores, and they projected a recovery cost of around $5,000 per site where we had backups. The client and legal moved toward a partial settlement after we produced the vendor audit and offered immediate compensation for proven losses, rather than an entire $40,000 claim. Mark was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the human resources investigation. He lost the promotion he had been courting. His name was no longer in the weekly wins email from the regional office. He spent the following weeks dealing with human resources and with internal audits instead of giving budget briefings. What happened to me next was quiet in its own way. I could have stayed and watched the process for months. Instead, I had already been interviewing with a smaller retail chain that valued documentation and systems and had a culture of supporting subject matter expertise. I had an offer in hand for a senior loss prevention systems role with a 40% salary increase and a clear path to lead their nationwide surveillance strategy. I gave my 2 weeks' notice. I did not gloat. I sent a concise resignation with a list of open tickets and a note saying I would assist the transition. People at Willow and Pine asked me to stay and help with the remediation. I had told myself I would not be the person who stayed to plug leaks for someone who had opened them deliberately. I refused to rescue the mistake. In the end, the legal settlement for the client was a fraction of their original demand once we produced evidence and negotiated in good faith. The vendor adjusted our retention settings back to 30 days while we evaluated long-term storage options. Human Resources issued a formal reprimand and required Mark to attend a compliance and leadership course, and he lost access to procurement approvals for a year. It was not a dramatic firing. It was a slow, steady erosion of credibility and responsibility that matched what he had risked. Willow and Pine tightened its internal controls and added an approval gate to any policy changes affecting security systems. I walked out of the office on my last day with a box of desk plants and a small plaque someone had given me for a project. People shook my hand. Grace stopped me in the hallway and said, "You handled that well, Ayet." I nodded. I did not need praise. I had been driven by a desire for accuracy and fairness more than vindication. There were details that surprised me. One unexpected twist was that the client who had threatened to leave ended up hiring our team to consult on their in-mall security plan because we moved transparently and paid for a temporary consultant to shore up the holes. Another surprise was that 2 junior team members who had been afraid to speak up found their voices after the audit showed the facts. They later sent me messages that said, "We learned how to document because of you." Those small outcomes felt like ripples from one honest timeline. I learned something simple and practical. If you are right, the safest thing you can do is not to yell that you are right. It is to build the record that proves it, to keep doing your work, and to let the proper channels see the truth. The world does not always hand you immediate justice, but the truth becomes difficult to argue with when it is written, time-stamped, and shown to the right people. I left Willow and Pine with better work, a better title, and no desire to watch someone else fall. I expected nothing dramatic to come of it, and what came was fair. Consequences that matched the mistake and the knowledge that I had stayed calm when the situation demanded it.